So how did I get into dual sport motorcycling? I've got a video, I'll link in the description below to that, how I got into motorcycle riding in general. Those little Trail 70s that my brother and I had, occasionally we would go to the local Honda shop. That's what we always called it, was, let's go to the Honda shop. It was Rainier Honda in the Spanaway, Washington area, which, lo and behold, that business still exists. I kind of got the hankering for, when I was old enough to buy a bigger bike, I wanted a Honda XL250, which later became known as the XR250L. The L represented the dual sport version when Honda dropped the XL nomenclature and switched it to XR. So I owned that Trail 70 from about, I don't know for sure, maybe 1982 to 1984, something along those lines. And then in 86 I joined the Air Force. 87 I got sent off after tech school to Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, and one of the guys that I worked with, he had a 1986 XR250L. That was his commuter bike, and during the good weather, like spring, summer, fall, when it got too cold to ride, he put it in storage. Well, he may not have been on the up and up as far as doing the necessary maintenance, like keeping up on oil changes or something. I don't know for sure, but it blew up on him, and it sat in somebody's garage for a year or so, and he was going overseas somewhere, so he sold it and I bought it. Granted, it had a blown up motor. I thought at the time that I could get that motor rebuilt fairly cheap. I pulled the motor out of the bike, took it down to a Honda dealer, asked them what it would cost to rebuild it, and they said parts and labor about $1,500. And I said, well, nope, on E2 pay, that's not going to happen. So that bike, I must have bought it in 1988, probably late 88, when he was getting deployed. So found out how much it was going to cost, decided I can't afford that. I sold it for $500. So I still had a desire to have a street legal off-road style bike. Back then they were kind of, I think, called enduro motorcycles. And then I believe that in the early 90s, could have very well been Suzuki invented the term dual sport when they came out with the DR-Z400S. They had a non-S and then the S. The S was the street version, or the dual sport version. So in early 94, my brother moved back home after he was done in the Air Force. We both started eyeballing dual sport bikes and settled on the 1994 DR-Z400 SE. We thought about the DR-250 and the KLR-250, but the DR-350 just checked all the boxes a lot better. So here we have another turn. So the 350 was only a couple $100, like $200 more than the 250, so it just made more sense to buy the 350. So back then, Suzuki, whoops, wrong gear. There was a dual sport series. It was called the AMA Suzuki National Dual Sport Series, And there was dual sport events all over the US that were sanctioned by the AMA and also kind of like promoted and backed by Suzuki. And there was actually a poster that Suzuki would send out to all the various dealers, and then Suzuki had a little dual sport newsletter. I think it was called the Suzuki Dual Sport Riders Club or something along those lines. I actually have a bunch of those still. I literally probably have all of them. So when you bought a dual sport bike from Suzuki, you automatically got enrolled in that Riders Club thing, and you got those little newsletters. So it was kind of like a little informal magazine type of publication. It's pretty cool. So there was quite a few events in Washington. There was basically a dual sport event practically every month from June through October. And my brother and I would do as many of those dual sport events as we could. The first one we did was put on by the Stump Jumpers Motorcycle Club out of Seattle, which that club still exists. It was August of '94 that we did that event, and due to the Tyee fire, they had to reroute a lot of it, so we ended up staying on the west side of Stevens Pass on Highway 2 for the entire route. It was a 2-day event. All the really good events were 2-day events. It was super neat to camp out and hang out with various people and meet new people and meet people to ride with and whatnot, especially on those 2-day events. So there was also the Black Dog Dual Sport event, which I did that for like 11 years straight. That was a 2-day event. That was probably, back in the day, one of my 2 top favorite events. Maybe the top of favorite because of it being a 2-day, and I'd go out there down into Oregon and camp out with friends that I met through motorcycle riding through dual sport events. And then another one that was a really fun one to do was put on by a company called Dual Star that made dual sport and adventure motorcycle accessories and gear and whatnot. They would host one out of Liberty, Washington, up towards Blewett Pass. Another good one that the Stump Jumpers did was the Easton Dual Sport. Hosted it at a little campground right behind the gas station in Easton. That probably is where I first encountered Don Weeks and Elmo Franzman. Probably that. I think that probably would have been the summer of 1995, possibly. Because we had arrived to camp early. What we used to do is take Friday off work on those 2-day events. And we got camp, we were setting up camp, and my brother pulled into a different campsite initially because it had a dump station and he wanted to dump his RV rather than drive all the way out to the dump station at the exit to the RV park. And so he's in that spot dumping his tank, and then Elmo pulls in and says, "Hey, this is supposed to be my campsite." And we talked to him and said, "Oh, we're just using the dump station here real quick. My tank was a lot fuller than I realized." And then I think either him or maybe him and Dawn started talking to us later, describing the event that they hosted. But we never really got a whole lot of detail about it. But anyway, we completely lost track of that dual sport event after they told us about it. And then I got reintroduced to it either late July or early August of 1997. So that was my very first Lake Wenatchee Dual Sport event, which now is known as the Dirty Face Dual Sport. I need to watch my stinking roll chart here. 11 miles I need to turn up a road, so I know exactly where that intersection is at. Uh, 1997 Lake Wenatchee Dual Sport event. So my brother and a friend of his and mine, who is somebody we knew from way back in our Boy Scout era, we loaded up our bikes on a trailer, packed all of our camping gear and stuff into the back of his little S10 truck. It was my brother's truck, and then towed our bikes over Saturday afternoon. Camped in a camping cabin at the KOA campground in Leavenworth, and then trailered our bikes over to the rec club early in the morning, and then rode the event. So lots of stories about that event. Back when the rec club would do 2 events per year, the first event was generally late June, and the second event was either late July or early August. And by the time the second event rolled around, all of the trail systems were open, and the Forest Service was okay with a handful of people riding the trails up there, because it literally was no more than a handful. Back in those early days, that very first event I did, there was just barely over 40 people that did the event, and only a handful of them did the trail options. So there was some trail work that had been done on the Lake Chelan side, and literally, yes, we did ride from Lake Wenatchee clear over 2 ridges to get to the trail system on the Lake Chelan side of the ridge. And there, a couple of the sweep guys were going to be staged at a certain area where the trail had been rebuilt just a little bit, for fear that people might have issues there, like slide off the edge. So now we are at 11, and yes, my roll chart's spot on here. This year we ran this section down. This year we're running it up, or next year. Lots of fun water bars to loft your front wheel over. Lots of ruts. Whoa, what the heck? So 1997 Lake Wenatchee Dual Sport event. Guys were staged on the trail where there had been some trail work done. I go through that section, and it sort of dropped a little bit. I mean, there was a sort of a little trail was kind of somewhat level, and then dropped a little bit down into a little bit of a draw, and then came back up. Nothing terribly steep or anything. The 2 guys were staged at that lower spot where the trail dropped a few feet in elevation, and I stopped there, and I got ready to get going again to climb out the other side, and my bike died, and then it wouldn't restart. Like, what the heck? Bike wouldn't start. It's like there was no power at all. So the two guys, one of them was Rob, who I later became good riding buddies with, and Jeff Fisher, the guy that was Don's good riding buddy that helped lay out the course. They push started me and got me going again, and then the two of them rode me out to a road. Basically, they took me back to the road where I could pick up the road and continue on the course. So I rode the rest of that rode down to the whatever. We actually were on some roads for a little ways before we hooked back up to the actual course. And they showed me where on the roll chart I was or whatever, and said, well, just follow this and you'll end up back down in Ardmore. So I did, and eventually I got down into Ardmore and hung out there for a while, and my brother and our friend Brian were there waiting for me, or they showed up after I was there for a while. I don't remember which. So a little troubleshooting, we figured out what happened is that on the DR-Z400S SE, the starter button engaged a relay, and a relay engaged a solenoid. So the relay between the starter button and the solenoid failed. So I was just using a pair of needle nose pliers or a giant screwdriver to jump the solenoid, just like you would do in an old school vehicle, to get the starter going. I strapped my side panel to the rear luggage rack so I'd have access to the solenoid, and that's how I went for the rest of the day. So that was my first time meeting Rob and Jeff. And then I always remembered Rob from that day on at other various dual sport events that I did. So I didn't really get to know Rob until the 2002 Black Dog Dual Sport. I had known that he lived in Washington because I saw Washington plates on his bike and his vehicle and whatnot, and started talking to him at that Black Dog event. Turned out he was there with his neighbor, so I ended up talking to them, and turned out he's pretty much had lived in Bonnie Lake, and I basically at that point I was sort of trying to find other people to ride with that lived near me in 2002. So Rob told me where he lived, and then one Sunday afternoon I hopped on my bike and rode out to where they lived and found their place. So him and his wife were building a house. They were just in the very early stages of starting their house construction at that point. And they were living on the property in a little Class C motorhome. And how I ended up officially meeting Don through Rob was in 2002. Rob was heading over to Lake Wenatchee area here to help Don lay out the course for the dual sport event. And Rob used to come over here and do a bunch of other riding with Don and Jeff as well. So that's what I did, is I rode over here with Rob. We carpooled in his car and went riding for the weekend. Did that a couple of times and spent the weekend over at Jeff's house. And then in later years, after Jeff moved away, Don had a secondary house, like a guest cabin or whatever, and that's where Rob and I would stay. So I started really getting involved in the dual sport event in the 2002-2003 time frame by hooking up with Rob when Rob was coming over here anyway, and then spending multiple weekends in a row. And there was a few times where, back in the era when we were staying in Don's cabin, we would come over one weekend and then had the plan to come over the following weekend, so we would just leave our bikes and trailer at Don's house and then tow them home the next weekend. And then, like, usually the following weekend was the dual sport event, or maybe there was one weekend in between our last trip over versus when the event was, and Don would just take care of everything else as far as course layout and whatnot. And then probably about the 2012 time frame, I think, was after I had been doing the roll chart for a number of years. That's when I got the idea that, you know, we should start laying out the course for the following year after we finish up the event, or sometime later that summer we should get it out riding, figure out a route for next year. So after I have primarily taken over as the guy to do the roll chart, although we do still, or we have really got heavy into doing GPS tracks, it's still useful to have a roll chart. So that's what I'm doing, is keeping track of everything from years past, rearranging different sections into a new route. Or that was a little baby chipmunk. It was about that tall. I didn't hit it. Yeah, rearranging sections, piecing sections together to make a new route, or running stuff in reverse. And the idea I always had with Don was, what we need to do is have 2 or 3 or maybe 3, or at the most 4 different routes, and just alternate them every year. So one year you do route 1, next year you do route 2, next year you do route 3, and then start over at route 1 and cycle through those, so you don't have to spend so much stinking time reinventing the wheel year after year after year. And as the one thing we kind of have discovered the last 2 years is that as the event gets bigger and has more participants, we have to dial back the amount of mileage just a little bit. It's kind of frustrating. I swear that every time I ride this, the mileage is, at some sections turn out just a little bit different.